you very much. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here and to share a few thoughts about what is the remarkable period that we are living through at this time. In a sense, I'm following in the footsteps of what Professor Galtung has been discussing with us. But I do believe that we are living through an extraordinary period of transition whose profound and far-reaching significance is still only at best dimly understood. And we know this because of the many labels that have been devised to capture something of the new reality or the new epoch that perhaps is in the making. Over a number of decades now, we've had such terms as atomic age, space age, electronic age, information age, global age, and many more. And interestingly, we have had the prefix post attached to many terms. Post-war, post-industrial, post-modern, post-Cold War, post-Westphalian, post-colonial, and even post-secular, all indicating that we are going through a period of far-reaching transition, even though it appears to be, it seems as if it is an old order that is dying, but a new one yet to be born, or at least certainly not yet named. Is there a way we can understand the change that is occurring? Difficult, but perhaps there is a key, and that refers to the extraordinary scale, intensity, speed of cross-border flows. Flows of all kinds, of goods and services, capital, technology, people, information, ideas, images, but also arms, carbon emissions, and viruses. These flows are global in their origin and global in their consequences. And as a consequence of these extraordinary flows that are encompassing the entire world, we can, I think, now detect a number of limits to the way the world has been organized over the last 2 or 3 centuries. There are clear limits now to empire, which we've seen with the dissolution of most of the world's empires. One remains standing. I'll have more to say about that in a moment. Limits to state sovereignty as the absolute organizing institutional principle of our time. Limits to economic growth, and limits even to science and technology. We have not reached the end of any of these, but each of them has its own limits. And in what I'm about to say, I want to concentrate in particular on one of these limits, the limits to empire. We can say that the post-Cold War period can best be understood, in part, as a contest for power. A contest for power between those intent on consolidating the supremacy of the United States and those determined to challenge it. But equally important, and not unconnected with this contest, are 2 other forces at work: the competition for markets, and perhaps most importantly in the long run, the contest of ideas and worldviews. Different ways of interpreting the world and evaluating pathways to the future, which is the theme with which I would like to conclude. It's clear that in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, US dominance appeared unchallengeable. The disintegration of the Soviet Empire, the survival of US alliances, consolidation of US security relationships in Asia-Pacific, the enlargement of NATO, the revival of the US economy during the 90s, Europe's inability to develop a viable strategy for Southeastern Europe, China's preoccupation with economic modernization, the technological sophistication of the US military machine. All these factors seemed to point in one direction: unrestrained US hegemony. US actions and pronouncements for the last quarter of a century appear to have radiated power. But I want to argue that this was, at best, elusive power. Simply put, the power of the American state was fragile. More fragile than appears to the naked eye. It's a fragility that came into full view when an American president and his advisors succumbed to the unilateralist temptation, more dramatically than any previous presidency. Of course, I'm referring to the George Bush presidency. But that was only symptomatic of what had been happening for some time. In pursuing a series of costly military expeditions, whether it be in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, or anywhere else, the United States, the American state, has demonstrated its weakness, not its power. And with that has come the difficulty of carrying the American public and securing and maintaining the support of governments in Europe, the Arab world, Pakistan, Japan, and elsewhere has proven taxing and almost always unrewarding for the American state. And perhaps most debilitating has been an internal contradiction. Though present in the latter part of the Cold War period, it has only become clearer with the passage of time. This is the contradiction between the grand New World Order, which the United States triumphantly proclaimed at the end of the Cold War, and the unwillingness and inability of the United States to establish the norms, the rules, and the institutions necessary for such a promised order. It has not been able to perform the kind of regulatory or coordinating role. Its role has been seen to be increasingly illegitimate. In the words of the French scholar Bertrand Badi, it is as if its role had shifted from being that of the world's would-be regulator to an unconcealed gladiator. There is, of course, more to the constraints on US power than these contradictions or the vagaries of international geopolitics. Equally important has been economic globalization and the impact of market competition. Let me just mention two very well-known trends. The United States had major trade surpluses in the aftermath of the Second World War into the 60s. It had a trade surplus of $6 billion in 64. It had a trade deficit of $4.1 billion in 74. The US trade deficit exceeded $100 billion by the early 80s. It reached $153 billion by 1987. And at the same time, in the 80s, budget deficits rose from $60 billion in 1980 to $220 billion in 1986. National debt doubled from $749 billion to $1.7 trillion. In 2004, the United States was borrowing on an annual basis $665 billion from foreign lenders to finance the gap between payments to and receipts from the rest of the world, an amount equivalent to $5,500 US per American household per year, borrowing. By June 2011, the gross external debt of the United States had reached 14.7 trillion US dollars. The world's greatest creditor in history had become the world's greatest debtor in human history. That is a snapshot of the decline of the American empire. And during this time, and especially over the last 30 to 35 years, we have seen the most dramatic expansion of world output registered by Asia, to a lesser extent in Latin America. Asia's share of world output increased from 15% in 1950 to 40% in 2010. And now we have a series of reports, including reports at the highest level in the United States, which paint the following picture. By 2030, very soon, Asia will wield more global power in all its forms, except perhaps military power, than the United States and Western Europe combined. Within 2 decades, and probably sooner, China will overtake the United States as the world's largest economy. And advanced nations in the West, many of them with aging population, will experience slower growth and almost certainly falling living standards. This is probably irreversible. So the question arises in the context of these extraordinary shifts taking place, which are themselves a subset of the larger transition I described earlier. The question arises, what is going to be the future world order? We can be more specific in the question we pose. What are the principles, the values, and importantly, the ideas which will breathe life into and sustain a new international order? Those who have proclaimed in the past the final triumph of the market and democracy now see that this line, by which is meant Western liberal democracy, of the American or Western European type, we can see now that, beguiling though it was, this line of argument was and is unsustainable. Too many remained unconvinced. Too many conflicts and divisions persisted. And no one seemed able or willing to develop the promised new order. The discourse proclaiming the triumph of the free market and Western liberal democracy has reached the end of the road. What then are the implications? It is clear that conflicts within societies, to the turmoil that we've seen, will probably continue, but it is equally clear that great power military expeditions will remain costly, become costlier, and almost certainly ineffectual. It is also clear that the United States can no longer exercise an effective hegemonic role, the role to which it has been accustomed. And this is the case, regardless of what US policy makers and strategic planners may think or want or attempt. And so in the emerging multicentric world, the time I want to suggest is fast approaching. Perhaps it has already arrived, when emerging and re-emerging societies and economies around the world, of which the BRICS grouping is the most striking example, though it's not the only one, will need to assume greater responsibilities. The need for leadership has never been greater. Leadership is needed, not hegemony, but leadership. And so these emerging and re-emerging societies will now need, and this is the main argument I want to put here, ways of moving beyond the politics of resistance to hegemony. Yes, hegemony, attempts at it, must continue to be resisted, but we have to move to the politics of initiative and away simply from the politics of blocking the moves of the would-be hegemon. And that means thinking through the norms that should guide the functioning of a globalizing, highly interconnected, yet fragmented, and at times deeply divided world. And here, I think Russian foreign policy represents an interesting test case. Russia, like China, the Brazils, the Indias, the South Africas, the Irans of this world, must assume leadership. Leadership. And we can see the beginnings of this in a number of statements of the current Russian president. And because time is short, if I can, I can refer you to the concept statement of February 2013, put out on behalf of the President of the Russian Federation. And we can see many of the embryonic ideas. There is a clear statement of the period of transition through which the world is going. If you're interested, paragraphs 5, 6, 8, 10, and 13. There is the beginnings of the idea of a normative framework, the need for a stable and sustainable system of international relations, the progressive development of law, international law, based on mutual respect and non-interference, the critical importance of the UN, and so on. That provides, I suggest, the basis for an active program, but one which takes several steps further over the next few years. That will be decisive, whether the next steps are taken. And of course, what is true of Russia is also particularly true of China and India. What do we need? In the last 3 or 4 minutes that I have, may I just convey the essence of what I think is needed? We need a sharper normative framework that addresses difficult questions, not in generalities, platitudes, but detailed, normative, conceptual approach. We need to resolve the tension between international obligations, the obligations of the international community to deal with major disasters of one kind or another, and the principle of national autonomy, which are distinguished from sovereignty. How is that balance to be struck conceptually? In some detail, what are the principles that should guide it? Similarly and relatedly, how do we address the balance between peacekeeping and peacemaking and peace enforcement on the other hand? We need to set out more clearly than has yet been the case what precisely is the role of intercultural and intercivilizational dialogue in shaping the future geopolitical international order. Not useful just for conferences and pleasant cups of tea. To shape geopolitics. How can intercivilization, intercultural dialogue give shape, meaning, and content to geopolitical order? If there is to be a re-emerging Silk Road, for example, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, what is to be the role of culture, religion, and civilizational impulse in the construction of such a Silk Road? We need to spell out more clearly, in such a normative framework, the demilitarization of international geopolitics. And in particular, a new concept, well, not a new concept, but a new formulation of an old concept, the relationship between humanity and nature, and the rights of nature and the responsibilities of humanity. All of this will be meaningless. No single country, emerging or re-emerging, can do that by itself. It has to be done in the closest possible consultation and coordination, and that is what is lacking. It is no use having a Russian initiative, or a Chinese initiative, or an Iranian initiative. There has to be done with close coordination and consultation, which means it will take time. There needs to be, these concepts will need to be translated into an action program. An action program for a renewed UN system. It's no use just saying we need a renewal. What does it look like? Who has to do what, when, and how? We need a methodical plan of action for nuclear and conventional disarmament, for the establishment of a Middle East zone free of all weapons of mass destruction, the entire Middle East. We need a methodical plan of action that reconciles energy security and climate change. And the likes of Russia, China, India, Iran, and Brazil have a great contribution to make as to how this will be possible. How can we achieve energy security and develop a program by 2015 which can deliver an international agreement capable of producing the goal of keeping global warming below 2 degrees centigrade? Let the initiative come not from the West, but from the emerging and re-emerging societies of the world. So, I think it is time for emerging and re-emerging societies, of course in consultation and coordination with people, groups and organizations of goodwill everywhere, to take the initiative. To take the initiative with humility, in coordinated fashion, and to point in credible and compelling words and actions, not least by example. What might be more hopeful pathways towards creating a habitable human future? There is a window of opportunity. It may not last forever, and we should all take advantage of it. Thank you.